Welcome to Kill Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are here in the studio. If you've been following us over the last few weeks, you have seen three parts of a four-part series around both out-of-the-box thinking and in-the-box thinking. There'll be a fourth segment that is coming up, so you want to stay tuned. You want to make sure you subscribe. So whether you're subscribing this to the podcast, you can find us on iTunes and iHeart and Spotify and all the normal places. If you're watching the video, click the subscribe button and not miss any of the upcoming shows. I think you'll find those very beneficial. So, with today, we have a guest in today's show, a guest that has been around in the industry for quite some time. In fact, before we started today's show, we were kind of comparing who we knew and histories and all that. It ends up that we were at two companies that worked very closely together, but we didn't overlap, which is kind of interesting, but we all know the same people. As the joke goes, there's no 6 degrees in today's world. We're down to about 3 degrees, going to 2.5 degrees here at a pretty quick pace. So, with that, I don't want to hesitate anymore. I want to bring the guest on so we get this conversation kicked off. Because I think today's topic is one that you are going to clearly find very interesting, but also very beneficial as you think through how do you take your innovations and how do you take your ideas. It's not just the idea that turns you into a winning product or service. It's much more than just the fact that you got a great idea. So with that, let me bring in today's guest. Today's guest is Brad Chase. He's the author of Strategy First: How Business Wins Big. Brad, welcome to Kill Innovations.
Hey, great to be here.
Hey, we were laughing as we were getting ready to start today's show. You spent many, many, many years at Microsoft. I was at HP, but we actually staggered. You left Microsoft before I came because I had ownership and interface responsibility for a number of programs between HP and Microsoft. But we were comparing who did we know, and it tended to be a lot of overlapping people. But we'll get to that part of the story because I think that'll just naturally come up. But give us a little bit of background around yourself. Introduce yourself to our listeners.
All right, glad to do that, Phil. So I started Microsoft in 1987 and worked on all sorts of products, from being the first marketing manager for Microsoft Office to leading the launch of Windows 95. Before that, I worked on MS-DOS, the last couple versions of that. I was involved in numerous internet initiatives and finally led MSN, turnaround of MSN in late 99 and 2000, early 2000.
And
After that, I did tons of consulting, board work, public speaking, and now my book.
and it's interesting because you were there at Microsoft in the very, very very early days. Did you join Microsoft like right out of school, or how did you end up getting in the door so early at a company that basically defined the personal computing world?
Well, that's a great story, actually. I'll tell it briefly. My stepfather used to go to Heathkit stores to build computers and TVs, stuff like that. A lot of people haven't heard of them. Heathkit stores were build it yourself electronic stores, basically.
Out
And
of
he
Be-
built this
out of
computer.
out of Benton Harbor, Michigan. I've been to the headquarters at Heathkit when I was a kid, and if I dusted off, ran over to my closet here, I could probably pull some Heathkit stuff out.
There you go. So you'd get a prize for that, Phil, I think. So my father built this computer, but he didn't know what to do with it. I mean, it was really old. It had a big, sort of central processing unit, a separate 8-sector hard disk drives, a keyboard, and so on. You actually pressed a numeric keypad to boot it up. So he bought that, and I was a sales rep at the time selling office products to stationery stores for Boise Cascade. And I said, I think this is going to be the next big thing, this personal computer thing. So I decided to go back to business school. I went to Northwestern, the Kellogg School of Business, which is a fantastic school. And I spent 1 year there on this special 1 year program that they have and still have, actually. And then afterwards, I interviewed with every tech company that I could, including HP, by the way. Uh, but my first choices were Apple and Microsoft, and I got a great job at Microsoft, and that's how sort of the story unfolded.
Yeah, you talk about HP, right? A lot of people may not even know, but and actually, if you go back into the show archive, you'll hear this story. But Steve Wozniak worked at HP in the calculator division, and he
Right.
actually used um, the board production runs and parts. He stole parts out of the HP supply cabinet to build the prototype motherboard for an Apple One, and then tried to get HP to take it to market, and HP declined. So I actually had Wozniak's direct manager on the show tell the story, and at the end of that whole story, he goes, "Well, who knew?" HP passed on the Apple One, and the rest is history, right? So,
It's amazing how many stories are like that, though. I mean, the story of how Microsoft got in the MS-DOS business,
right.
the story of how Steve Jobs actually got into, sort of the iPhone, doing the iPhone. There are really interesting, hilarious stories and surprising stories behind those. A couple of those stories I tell in the book, actually, Strategy First.
Well, yeah, it is interesting, right? Because look, in the early days, I came to Silicon Valley. My first time out was 1984, and my one claim to fame is I wrote software that shipped in the 1984 Mac, so in the original Mac launch. So, and I wrote some software for for HP's Vectra, which was the very first PC that HP ever shipped back then. I wasn't working for HP then, but the world was really small, and who and who you met, everybody just, kind of moved around a little bit, but it was kind of the same sphere of, of people as I said in the opening, the 6 degrees of separation does not apply, particularly in the tech world. It's like 2.5 degrees, If you're more than 2.5 degrees, then you're an outsider, from the space. So
Yeah,
while you
that's
were
true.
at Microsoft, you had MSN, but you also were on the Windows 95 team, if I recall correct, right?
Yeah, I actually led the marketing of Windows 95, which is a great innovation story. Both the product and the marketing were very, very innovative for their time.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the launch event. It was one of the first of what I would call the crazy spend way over the top, you know, having famous people be part of a launch event kind of a thing.
Well, we spent less than people think, but we did spend a lot. But that's because we were trying to make Windows 95 a consumer phenomenon. It was really the first operating system to help PCs go mainstream. Windows 95 sort of ushered personal computers, and for that matter, Microsoft and Bill Gates into the mainstream.
Yeah, it was interesting because you actually had to go cut a deal. Was it who was it? Was it Rolling Stones or
Yeah, I
yeah,
did a
yeah.
I did a now famous deal with the Rolling Stones for the rights to Start Me Up for the advertising, TV advertising that we launched with the release of Windows 95.
Yeah, well, and those of us have been around for a while. There's probably there's probably some listeners on the show who don't even remember Windows 95. But, uh, for those of us that were in the space, when you remember the old DOS world, and I go back even prior to that, back to the CPM days, pre-DOS, experiences, and, Apple on the Apple II, Apple One. You're right. Windows 95, which wasn't just the kind of the kludgy version of GUI. It was really a well thought out, well constructed, and it became kind of the thing that everybody wanted to achieve, particularly market adoption wise, because it took off like a rocket. Everybody was on 95 in a pretty short time frame.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we were trying to achieve with the product itself and the marketing of Windows 95.
Yeah, my guess is though is Microsoft probably. There's a flip side of that. There's probably still some people who are still running Windows 95, and in fact, I've seen some of those systems that are still running Windows 95.
I have to say I haven't seen that in a long time, but
Yeah, you either got 95 or you got a Windows 2000 box. There's a lot of embedded systems that all have some of those old platforms around. But hey, if it works, it works, right? You don't think about it. But
well, what's interesting too is how the Windows 95 technology and experience has pervaded. I mean, the start menu is perhaps the most visible example. I mean, we innovated with the start menu back for Windows 95, and then when Microsoft tried to take the start menu away, a decade later, people got very upset, and so they had to basically put it back.
I remember when that happened. It was the magic revolt, right?
Right.
not showing how do I launch something if you don't give me a start window? How do I start something, right? People,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that is a little bit of the innovation challenge, right? Because once you've trained a user base to think a certain way, the nomenclature, the mental models, and all that are very, very hard to change, and you have to account for that when you're getting ready to come out with new products or new services. So, Brad, there's must be some background in your lessons learned over your career that led you to come up with this strategy philosophy, which we'll talk later in the show here about specifically about the book. But I'm interested in the backstory of your experiences that led to, I don't know, elevating strategy to almost a different level than just the typical way companies and organizations think about strategy. What's the background on this?
So it all started when I went to Microsoft, basically. The central importance of strategy I learned from Bill Gates. And when I was entering Microsoft, I learned about how Microsoft had bet on the PC. Because remember, when Microsoft started, the personal computer was just a hobbyist tool at best. And Microsoft and Bill and his partner Paul Allen decided that they believed that there would be a PC on every desk and in every home running Microsoft software. And that was what they were shooting for. So right away, I learned the importance of making bets and how making bets was fundamental to your success. Bet on the wrong thing, you fail. Bet on the right thing, then you can have a chance to be successful. And in fact, what was really interesting is Microsoft, when I started, was being very successful with MS DOS as an operating system on the PC. But Microsoft was doing very poorly on applications like word processing and spreadsheets. The leaders at the time were WordPerfect for word processing and Lotus 123 for spreadsheets. They dominated on MS DOS PCs. And I saw that Microsoft was figuring out a strategy to win. And that strategy was we were going to bet on GUI. GUI is spelled GUI, and it stands for Graphical User Interface, something like what Windows has or what the Mac has. And Microsoft decided the only way they were going to take MS DOS to the next level was to turn it into a graphical user interface, Windows. And the only way they were going to beat Lotus 123 on spreadsheets and WordPerfect on word processing was to change the platform because people weren't going to switch to one of Microsoft's application products on MS DOS because they already knew Lotus 123 and WordPerfect. But if they were switching to Windows anyway and we had great Windows apps, maybe they would switch. And then I saw that come to fruition. Microsoft bet on Windows, a big, risky bet at the time, actually, and it was successful. And then Microsoft created Microsoft Excel, Microsoft Word for Windows, later added PowerPoint and other Windows applications. And Lotus did not bet on Windows, and WordPerfect did not bet on Windows. And then Microsoft became the leader, not just in the operating system business, but in the applications business. So I witnessed a strategy become successful. And I realized then that strategy is the anatomy of business success.
Well, it's interesting because it was a big bet, right? And those of us that were around at that time, I don't think people appreciate you know, how much market share, for instance, that Lotus 123 had. And everybody thinks, oh, well, Lotus 123 was the first spreadsheet. Well, no, VisiCalc was the first spreadsheet.
I used it.
There's always somebody before you. But even like VisiCorp, right, the company behind VisiCalc, they were doing their own GUI with Vision. And I got somehow sucked into that project. That if you want to go look up in Wikipedia if you want to go in the Wayback Machine and look at what Vision was. Um, but it required that disruption, that concept disruption of that it's not just the application, but it's the platform plus the enablement of the applications that becomes a different player, right?
Yeah, and in fact, that was key to the strategy because not only did Microsoft become the leader in applications, but as more people used Windows and more applications got written, more people used Windows, and then more people wrote more applications, and then more people bought Windows at personal computers. And that network effect is something actually I talk about in the book. It's one of the many strategies I call building tall walls that help you be successful. And it's a frequent strategy of technology companies is to build tall walls via network effects. And you could do that when you have a platform. your iPhone is a really great product, and you're probably not going to switch because not it's not just the iPhone, it's all the apps you use, and it might be the AirPods, and it might be you use FaceTime. All those things get you loyal to the Apple platform
Well, it is,
for iOS.
but what was different though is yeah, you could attract, but like in the case of Windows, it wasn't the walled garden, right? Anybody could sell an application. You could back then take your disks, stick your disks and load it and run it. It wasn't the situation. It's a little bit of a different model today, right? Because if you think about comparing the iPhone to the Windows model, the iPhone, you got to get it through the iOS App Store, right? In the
Yeah,
case
and
of
that's right. And in fact, the difference is broader than that because Windows computers could be built by anybody.
right,
So it wasn't just the applications that were open to everyone, it was the whole ecosystem. Whereas the Apple ecosystem is a closed ecosystem, as you just mentioned.
right,
And
and
so those are different types of strategies.
what it does, and
Apple's,
it has an interesting side effect because of the cost of the platform, right?
that's right.
Like
Well, one of
when
the
I was at
reasons
HP,
Windows,
I would always complain to Bill Gates and Ballmer every time I met with them. Is like, look, we're living on 3.5, 4% operating profit, so don't don't be passing costs down to us as an OEM builder. When between you and Intel, you guys are walking away with 80% of the OP on the ecosystem, right?
well, in fact, that was another brilliant part of Bill's strategy. He focused the company on software, not hardware, and it's a more profitable place to be.
Oh, it is. It's incredibly more profitable. And if you got partners that you can get multiple hardware players out there, but you also think Microsoft was good about the hardware guys had a lot of room to innovate to bring value to their hardware platform versus somebody else's hardware platform. But
That's right.
it became the point with it really does get driven, by the applications. Now, if I recall though correctly, even some of the early Windows apps from Microsoft came from acquisition, not just, so at the time, Microsoft wasn't just saying, we're going to build every application up from the ground up. We're also going to potentially acquire best of breed in some applications that Microsoft was not active in at the time, right?
Microsoft bought PowerPoint, for
Yeah,
example, but
exactly.
most of the other key applications at the time we built ourselves.
Isn't Visio? I thought Visio was also, but Visio was a later in life thing. But
Later in
Visio,
life, yeah, it came
yeah, but
later in life.
Visio was another one that was an acquisition, right? So
It never was as central to Office as word processing or spreadsheets
yeah,
or presentation software or database,
yep,
and so on.
exactly. And the other piece though on the strategy side though is that I'm going to guess, given particularly since you've left Microsoft, that there's a number of companies and organizations that probably have not prioritized strategy as maybe they should or could. In fact, we were talking before the break around your innovation strategy. What I'm interested in hearing about now is your book. How did you take that innovation strategy, and what led you to think that it needed to be consolidated, into a book? Having been an author and knowing how hard it is to actually work through that process to actually publish, congratulations on that. But give us kind of that transition of the idea of strategy. But you've been gone from Microsoft for quite some time, but obviously there's lessons learned that help spur you along since then.
Right, Phil. So it started with me doing talks to businesses and MBA students. And I started doing this strategy talk, and then people would come up after the talk and say, "Where's your book? Where's your book?" And so that's when I decided to do the book. And I did a little research and found out there were no books that talked about strategy in sort of a non academic, non intellectual way that made strategy clear and easy for a wide range of business leaders and aspiring business leaders. And so that's why I wrote strategy first. And the goal of the book is to make it clear that A, strategy is the most important thing to the success of a business leader, building a successful strategy, and B, give you a model and some tips for how to actually build winning strategy.
And you know, every organization, when you say the word strategy, you can get 1,000 different opinions and 1,000 different ways that organizations either think about strategy or don't think about strategy. A lot of organizations that I've coached or mentored CEOs on, I would say, almost has an accidental strategy. The strategy is kind of the momentum versus really having a plan or a vision. I'm sure you've seen a wide range of companies and they're thinking about strategy.
Yeah, I've seen a wide range. I've seen lots of definitions of strategy, and I've seen perhaps even more companies where if you take the leadership team and ask them what the company strategy is, they all have a different answer. I define strategy very simply as your plan to compete. And your plan to compete has three key elements: execution, market potential, and customer value. And they matter relative to the competition.
So
And to help people remember that, I came up with what I call the strategy first model, which is E times MC squared, kind of a fun takeoff on Einstein's famous equation. And the E, it's mnemonic. The E is for execution, the M is for market potential, and the C is for customer value.
so talk us through that. When you say customer value, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean the inherent value of a product or service to a customer, not per se the price, but the whole kit and caboodle. So your podcast talks about innovation. There's a real value relative to other podcasts about listening to what you do, Phil, and learning about how companies innovate to succeed. And that's what I mean by customer value is the actual value of the product or service. And in most businesses, customer value is by far the most important thing to the success of a strategy, which is why the C is squared, right? There are exceptions. If you're in a commodity business, then customer value is the same for all products in the category. But in most strategies, your customer value is better and most important success. I mean, look at Tesla and what they've done with cars, or look at Apple and what they've done with a lot of their products. Look what Microsoft's done a lot of their products. You can take company after company. Most strategies are a fundamental bet. Tesla electric cars, Apple consumer devices, and so on and so forth. And that fundamental bet, uh, the key parts are customer value, market potential, and execution.
So talk about that market potential some more. How do you quantify that? Because I used to do a lot more angel investing. I don't do much anymore, right? But I've seen every business plan with every type of strategy and people doing, total addressable market positioning to um, position against competitors. So how do you define the market potential for an idea?
So market potential is generally about how much profit you can make. That's easy to measure in some businesses, but in most, probably not. So there's some, financial analysis you can do, and sometimes it's a bit of instinct. There are exceptions. I mean, in some businesses, market potential might be how many customers you have. A company like Twitter, went public without making any money. A company like WhatsApp was bought by Facebook for $19 billion and it was losing money. So there are exceptions, especially in the tech world. But generally, market potential is about looking at a business and a strategy and saying, how much money can I make in that business?
And in your experience, when you're working with everything from small startups up to the large companies, how many organizations have a good grasp on what they think the market potential really is, or is it more of a little finger in the air thing to kind of see which way the wind's blowing?
It varies dramatically, right? Not surprisingly. There are many companies who are very precise about measuring market potential and building a good model of what they think that should be. And they do that, for innovations. They do that for acquisitions. They do that in all sorts of cases. And there are other cases where people are just, guessing. They don't really, really know.
Well, in the case of what we teach in the innovation bootcamp course I teach is to evaluate an idea, we actually don't look at the financials. What we say is value the idea first, just from the standpoint of impact and achieving the objective or solving the problem statement or an opportunities target. Once you've identified those high ranking ideas, the first phase is build a hypothesis on what you think the market potential is, and then go test it and go validate it, right?
Right,
because
right.
you're not going to
You got to
know.
validate the market potential of the customer value. Sometimes you have customer value, but you don't have a big market. Sometimes you have a big market, but you don't have customer value. And remember, the other key part of that is to compare that idea, that innovation, that strategy relative to the competition. I mean, without strategy, innovation is aimless. But
Right.
with innovation, strategy has tons of potential. Innovation is has tons of potential.
Right. And this gets into, I get a lot of emails from people saying, "Yeah, but I've got this really great idea. It should be a big win." I'm like, an idea by itself, the difference between a good idea and a great idea, there's a lot of things that are not in your direct control, but there are some things you can't put in your direct control that turns that idea into something that can be significant and have high impact. It's not just about the idea. And I think that's where some people in the innovation space kind of get themselves off into the weeds because they just focus on the idea and they don't think about the strategy. They don't think about the timing. Might be a great idea, but boy, the market timing just isn't quite right for it.
Right. If you have bad market timing, it ends up to be a bad idea.
Well, and we can point to a lot of those, right? We were laughing during the commercial break, right, about the iPhone, right? I've had so many people like, "Oh, Apple invented the smartphone." No, but did Apple get the timing right? You betcha. And a lot of things people don't understand is the iPhone was done for many years. The concept was ready to go, but they waited. They needed another round of Moore's law to get a better performance, so the screen touch worked better. They had to work with Corning to get better glass made. Patience in the innovation space can have big rewards. Getting that timing right is hard.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I often bring up a company called Visria, which no one's ever heard of. Well, Visria had great technology to do a lot of what Instagram does today, but they were too early,
Yep.
and as a consequence, they ended up going under. And there's more to the story, but the short thing answer is that they had super technology and bad timing, and made a few sort of strategic errors. If they didn't make those errors and had good timing, they would have been Instagram before Instagram.
Well, this brings up the interesting analogy that a lot of people in the tech world look at is, do you really want to be the first one out with a brand new idea, or is being second, not a bad position, right? Look, Microsoft didn't invent the GUI. Apple did not invent the GUI. It came from Xerox PARC. Smartphone did not come from Apple. Lotus did not create, spreadsheets. Google did not invent search, right? So you don't always have to be, the first one out of the gate to achieve success. So, Brad, as we came out of the last segment, I put the challenge out for you to uh, give some, I don't know, pointers, I guess, or to think for our listeners to think about strategy, things that they could take advantage of immediately while they're waiting for your book to arrive, by the way. So, uh, but what would be some of those pointers you would give to a listener, or the philosophy, how they think, you know, what could they take advantage of right away?
So let me start by saying in the book Strategy First, I give 5 key tips to building winning strategies. Let me talk about a couple here. The first is seek change. That's one place innovation fits in, for example. Whenever there's change in a market, there's strategic opportunity. COVID is a dramatic tsunami change, for example, that's impacting things in a big way. So there's lots of change that have totally transformed industries. Think about the internet, just to pick one example. And that sea change has made some businesses fail and others dramatically succeed and completely change the business landscape. Another tip that I tell people is mind the gaps. And this is sort of what you and I were talking about before. Not everything is an innovation. Not everything is, you have to be first to be best. Minding the gaps is about looking at the key areas of a strategy, customer value and execution, and seeing where people are not doing well and seeing where you can fill those gaps. So, for example, Google wasn't the first search. Other people were doing search before Google. Google built a better search and mined the customer value gap. So those are two key tips. And then the last thing I would tell people is do a strategy offsite. I have worksheets on my website that you can use if that will help you. And what you do is you basically first do an assessment of what your strategy is now and make sure all the leaders in the team agree on what your strategy is. And that, as we discussed earlier, isn't always the case. And then discuss where do you want to take your strategy and where do you want to go given the changes in the competitive environment and the external world around you.
Well, the last one is an interesting one, right? Because I've attended a lot of strategy offsites, and it almost seems a little bit overly ambiguous, I guess, is the best way to describe it. What's the key to putting more structure behind that rather than just letting it be a bunch of flip charts and a bunch of post-it notes?
Well, the first part is the assessment. So what I tell people is honestly look at your customer value and your execution relative to competition and uh, give yourself a number on a scale of say 5. That's what I use in the book. And with that number you could actually even give yourself a score. My execution, I'm giving myself a 4. On customer value I give myself a 3.5, and on market potential I give the market a 4. Multiply that out and then compare that to the competition. And that gives you a good concrete way to say, this is how we're doing. It's not scientific, purely a gauge, but it gives you a place to start your discussion.
Right.
And with that score compared to the competition, then you could have the real discussions. How do I separate more from the competition? How do I give myself a greater disparity so that I'm in a better situation? Can I provide more customer value? Can I innovate? Can I come up with a new business model? Are there new products that I could come up with? And that's where you bring everyone together and make it very concrete.
Well, and here's, we were talking before about, the fact that, if you go around and you ask 10 executives within an organization, what the organization's current strategy is, odds are you're going to get 10 different answers.
Right.
One of the benefits of doing this kind of an offsite is getting alignment, right? Talking it out amongst so that when people leave the room, hope at least that you've got alignment on a strategy to go forward that can rally the troops then, right?
That's right. I mean, it's just so strange that companies don't agree on strategy, even though they think they do. And if not every leader agrees what the strategy is, then when you execute, you're executing based on different strategies,
Right.
and that will lead to failure. So it's really important you have alignment on strategy. And once you have alignment on what your bets are, what your strategy is, then you can go and say, okay, how are we going to execute? And that involves many important things: knowing what your goals are, knowing what your strategy is, knowing what your priorities are and your principles, and aligning and communicating and tracking how you're doing.
Well, and I'm a big believer of what I call the rule of locker room, right? So the executive in the locker room, everybody, can argue, disagree, present, offer counterpoints, present new ideas, whatever. But when you leave the locker room, the play's been called. Everybody needs to be executing the play, not their own play. And I've seen organizations and teams just get totally destroyed because you get this everybody's in the locker room and people think the locker room is still the point they're at, even though they're trying to execute on some grand vision or strategy.
Oh yeah, it's so true. It's a great observation. I like the analogy as well. There's no team sport that's going to do well unless everybody's on the same page. And business is a team sport.
Yeah, and then we talk about it all the time here on the show that innovation's a team sport. If you think you're going to be the lone inventor and you're going to knock it out of the park, good luck. Look, Bill Gates, had Paul Allen and Ballmer, right? You had Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Bill Hewlett and David Packard, right? Even the icons that we hold up as just being the leaders out there, and I know Elon Musk pretty well, and he would even argue it's maybe he gets all the FaceTime, but it's a team activity. So hey Brad, as we wrap up, if people want more information, follow you, find the book, where's the best place they can locate it?
So to get the book, it's available, of course, on Amazon and at Barnes and Noble and in your favorite independent bookstore. To follow me, I'm on LinkedIn. You can follow me there. My website is bradchase.net, and you can follow me in my blog posts there.
Great. And we'll have all these links up on the Killer Innovations show notes. So just hop over to killerinnovations.com. Hey, Brad, thanks for taking the time to join us today here on Killer Innovations.
Absolutely my pleasure, Phil. It was fun.
Great. As we wrap up today's show, I would ask that you just, subscribe, follow, let me know, give us some feedback. You can send me an email at phil@killerinnovations.com. If you like today's show, let somebody else know, share it, and help get the word out about what we're doing here. And with that, we will talk to you next week. Bye bye.